When prosecutors laid out their case against Josh Duggar, they used words that should reframe how anyone thinks about this. Not opinion words, not tabloid words. The kind of language that trained federal attorneys put their names on official court filings, knowing every syllable would be scrutinized for years to come. So today on Jenny Exposes, we are going straight to the record. We are pulling back the curtain on what the government actually argued, what the prosecutors believed, and what the judge himself said out loud in that courtroom. If you have ever wondered why this case landed the way it did, you are about to understand it in a way most people never will. So stay with me, because by the end of this video, you are going to look at the entire Duggar saga differently. Before we go further, if you are new to this channel, I am Jenny, and what I do here is take the stories everyone thinks they already know and show you the parts the headlines glossed over. The Duggar family has been one of the most examined, most defended, and most exposed dynasties in reality television history. And inside that whole long story, the Josh Duggar federal case is the moment where the polished image and the legal reality finally collided in front of a federal judge. If you want more of these deep dives, hit that subscribe button right now, because we have a lot more coming and you do not want to miss what is next. Now let me start with something important. I am not here to speculate. I am not here to invent motives or pretend I can read anyone's mind. What I am going to walk you through today is documented. It comes from filings entered into the federal court record, from the sentencing memorandum filed by the United States, from statements made on the record, and from the judge's own remarks at sentencing. That is the standard I want to hold to, because this is a case where speculation has done enough damage already. The facts on paper are heavy enough on their own. So who actually prosecuted this case? Because a lot of viewers think of it as a vague thing that happened in a courtroom somewhere in Arkansas. It was much more coordinated than that. The case was brought by Assistant United States Attorneys Carly Marshall and Dustin Roberts out of the Western District of Arkansas, working alongside trial attorney William G. Clayman from the Department of Justice's Child Exploitation and Obscenity Section. Think about what that means for a second. The Child Exploitation and Obscenity Section is a specialized unit inside the Department of Justice. These are not general prosecutors who got handed a random case. These are federal attorneys whose entire professional focus is this category of crime. When you see that lineup on the filings, you are looking at the kind of coordinated federal effort the government reserves for cases it considers serious. This was not a small matter. The resources behind the prosecution tell you exactly how the government viewed it from the beginning, and the language they used reflected that. Because here is where we get to the heart of it. In the sentencing memorandum that the government filed before Josh Duggar was sentenced, prosecutors described him as having, and I'm quoting directly from the filing, a deep-seated, pervasive, and violent. I want you to sit with that phrase for a moment. Deep-seated, pervasive, violent. Those are not throwaway adjectives. Federal prosecutors do not put words like that in a sentencing memo casually. Every sentence in that document gets read by the judge, gets cited on appeal, gets entered into the permanent court record. And those three words, stacked together, are about as severe a characterization as you will see in a filing of this kind. Deep-seated meaning not a moment of weakness, not a stumble, but something rooted. Pervasive meaning not contained, not isolated, but reaching across his behavior. And violent. That word in particular changes how you read everything else. The government was not describing curiosity. The government was not describing addiction in the soft sense. The government was telling the court that what they had documented amounted to and that assessment came from prosecutors who had reviewed the full evidence file. Now, think about what that means for the public narrative. For years, defenders of the Duggar family framed the earlier allegations as something that had been handled internally, something that belonged in the past, something the family had moved through. The government's characterization in the sentencing memo blew straight through that framing. They were not describing a closed chapter. They were describing an established pattern that, in their view, had never actually resolved. And that brings us to the next critical piece of their argument, which is the question of future risk. Because in federal sentencing, prosecutors are not just arguing about what happened. They are arguing about what is likely to happen if the person walks free again. And the government's position on that question was unambiguous. They argued that there was no credible reason to consider Josh Duggar a low risk for reoffense. And they made a line that I think every viewer should hear, because it is one of the cleanest pieces of legal logic you will see in a filing like this. The prosecutors wrote, in essence, that a low risk is not the same as no risk. Read that again. A low risk is not the same as no risk. What they were doing with that sentence was dismantling the defense's likely argument before it could even land. Because the defense was going to argue that their client posed a minimal threat, that he had support systems, that the chance of him doing this again was small. And the prosecution preempted it by saying that even if you accept the most favorable risk assessment imaginable, that assessment is still not zero. And when the category of harm is children, the calculation cannot be the same as it would be for almost any other offense. That argument is part of why the government pushed as hard as it did on the length of the sentence. So what evidence did they lean on to support that view? This is where it gets harder, because the prosecution did not float its conclusions in the air. They anchored them in something specific. They pointed back to the previously reported incidents in which Josh Duggar had, as a teenager, molested 5 young girls, including 4 of his own younger sisters. Those incidents had been part of the public record for years, surfaced originally in 2015 through reporting on documents from an Arkansas police investigation. The family addressed it at the time. The show that made them famous was eventually canceled in the aftermath. But what the prosecution did at sentencing was different from anything the family had ever framed publicly. The prosecution treated those past incidents not as a closed chapter, not as a youthful failing that had been processed and moved past, but as direct evidence of an established pattern. They told the court, in effect, that what they were now sentencing him for was not the beginning of his behavior, it was the continuation of it. And in a federal sentencing posture, that framing matters enormously, because it shifts the entire conversation from a single mistake to a documented trajectory. One incident can be explained, a pattern cannot. Now, I want to be very careful here, because I am talking about events that involve minors, including minors within the same family. I am not going to describe the details. I am not going to dramatize anything. The point of bringing those past incidents up is only to tell you what the government brought up at sentencing and how they used it, because that is the spine of the case I am walking you through. Everything I am saying in this video comes from documents you could find for yourself if you wanted to read them, and that is intentional. I want you to be able to verify it. That brings us to the question, because in federal sentencing, the prosecution makes a recommendation and the defense makes a recommendation, and the judge weighs both before making a decision. And the gap between the two recommendations in this case was enormous. The prosecutors asked that Josh Duggar serve the maximum sentence of 20 years in federal prison. The defense team asked for 5. 5 years versus 20 years. That is not a small disagreement. That is 2 completely different portraits of the same defendant standing in front of the same judge. The defense was framing their client as someone who could be rehabilitated, someone whose offense, while serious, did not warrant the full weight of the available sentence. The prosecution was framing him as someone whose pattern, characterization, and risk profile required the heaviest sentence the statute allowed. And what makes that gap so striking is that both sides were looking at the same evidence file. Both sides had access to the same record. They simply reached fundamentally different conclusions about what kind of person was in front of them. The judge then had to choose which portrait was closer to the truth. And here is where the judge's own words enter the picture. Because the judge did not stay neutral in his remarks at sentencing. He spoke directly to the question of future risk. In court, the judge expressed concerns that the defendant might reoffend in the future. That is the judge, not the prosecution, not a commentator. The presiding federal judge, looking at the defendant in front of him, told the courtroom that the possibility of future offense was something he was concerned about. When you have alignment between the prosecution and the bench on the question of dangerousness, that tells you something important about how the court perceived the case. The judge is not supposed to be advocating for either side. The judge is supposed to be the neutral evaluator who weighs everything and arrives at a measured outcome. When even the neutral evaluator voices concern about future risk, You are looking at a case where the dangerousness argument was not a stretch made by aggressive prosecutors. It was a conclusion that the bench itself found credible. This is the part of the case that I think the public never fully absorbed at the time. People remember the headlines, they remember the verdict, they remember the sentence handed down. What they often do not remember, or never knew in the first place, is what was said in the moments leading up to that sentence. Because the sentencing memorandum and the judge's remarks are where the legal system gave its actual assessment of the defendant. And that assessment was significantly more severe than the way the case was packaged in most coverage. Most coverage focused on the celebrity angle, the fall from reality television fame, the famous family, the collapsed public image. What the actual court filings focused on was something far more sobering. They focused on the assessment that this was not an isolated incident, that the behavior was rooted, that the risk of recurrence was real, and that the maximum sentence was warranted as a matter of public safety. I want to take a breath here and say something directly. I am not on this channel to wallow in graphic detail. I am not going to walk you through what was in the evidence. I am not going to describe the content the government recovered. The reason I am not going to do that is the same reason the prosecution itself was careful with how it presented certain material. The point is the assessment. The point is the risk. The point is the accountability. And nothing about cataloging the disturbing specifics serves any of those points. If you want a channel that does that, you can find it. This is not that channel. What I want you to walk away with is an understanding of how serious federal prosecutors took this case and why their reasoning matters. Not a play-by-play of evidence that should never be sensationalized. Now let me zoom out for a moment, because I think this case sits inside a much larger conversation about how families like the Duggars present themselves to the public versus what is actually happening inside the walls. For years, the family was sold to America as a model of a certain kind of life, a certain kind of order, a certain kind of moral framework. And during all of those years, the seeds of this case had already been planted. By the time the federal investigation closed in on Josh Duggar, the disconnect between the brand and reality had grown into something the public could no longer ignore. The prosecution did not need to argue that disconnect. The prosecution only had to lay out what they had on the record. But the disconnect is part of why this case landed with such weight in the cultural conversation. People felt deceived. People felt that an image had been carefully maintained while serious behavior had been kept out of view. And the court filings put a kind of finality on that conversation. Because once federal prosecutors describe someone using the kind of language they used in this filing, there is no rebrand that can paper over it. Something else worth noting. The way the government argued this case had implications beyond the defendant himself. When prosecutors stack characterization language the way they did, when they invoke pattern evidence, when they argue for the maximum sentence, they are doing something larger than securing a verdict. They are putting a marker down. They are saying, on the record, in a high-profile case, that this category of offense will not be treated as a single failure or a private matter. It will be treated as the public safety question that federal law treats it as. And in a case that millions of people were watching, that marker carries weight beyond the courtroom. Other prosecutors read these filings. Other defendants read these filings. Survivors read these filings. The line "a low risk" is not the same as "no risk," is the kind of line that gets quoted in other cases for years afterward, because it captures something true about the math of these decisions. Let me come back to the question I asked at the start of this video. Does the government's reasoning change how you see the sentence? Because I think for a lot of people, the sentence handed down felt like it sat in a vacuum. It was a number. It was years. It was a man going to federal prison. But once you understand the reasoning behind the government's recommendation, once you see the language they used in the memo, once you hear the judge himself voicing concerns about future risk, the sentence stops feeling like an arbitrary outcome. It starts looking like a measured response to a documented assessment, made by professionals whose job it is to make exactly that kind of assessment. That does not mean everyone agrees with the outcome. People will always disagree about sentencing in cases like this. Some will think it was too harsh. Some will think it was not harsh enough. But the reasoning is no longer a mystery. It is on paper. It is in the record. And you now have access to it. I want to leave you with one more thought before we wrap. The reason I make these videos is not to pile on a family that has already been through years of public reckoning. It is because I genuinely believe that the audience deserves to know what was actually said in that courtroom, not just what got summarized in a headline. Headlines compress. Headlines simplify. Headlines sometimes miss the most important sentence in a 50-page filing. And when a case has the cultural footprint this one does, the difference between a compressed version and the full version matters. The full version is what changes how you think about it. The full version is what I tried to walk you through today. So here is what I want you to do. If this video gave you a clearer picture, drop a comment below and tell me whether the government's reasoning changes how you see the sentence. I read those comments, I learn from them, and the conversation under these videos is part of why I keep making them. If you are not already subscribed to Jenny Exposes, hit that subscribe button now, because the next video is going to dig into another corner of the Duggar story that has been sitting in plain sight without ever getting properly examined. Hit the like button if this one was worth your time, because that is the single biggest thing you can do to help the channel grow. And I will see you in the next one. Stay sharp out there.